Some notes do not ask for attention. They stop a life in its tracks. On a cold Thursday night in downtown Chicago, the dining room at Hawthorne Grill glowed like a postcard for people who had never worried about a bill in their lives. Amber pendant lights floated above polished walnut tables. Crystal glasses caught the light like little fires, and the smell of butter, seared beef, and expensive red wine drifted through the air with the confidence of money. At table 17, a man in a worn charcoal coat sat alone, shoulders damp from the sleet outside, his boots darkened by dirty March slush. No one looked at him twice unless it was to decide he did not belong there. He had asked for the 12-ounce sirloin, cooked medium, and a glass of water with no lemon. Nothing fancy, nothing that should have made anyone stare. But in places like this, people were not judged by what they ordered. They were judged before they even sat down. Mason Reed felt every glance without lifting his head. He had come here looking ordinary on purpose, beard left rough, watch swapped for a cheap drugstore one, leather wallet replaced with a cracked canvas billfold. He wanted to know what happened to a man when the world thought he could not afford dignity. The answer had arrived fast. Service that moved slower at his table than anywhere else. A host who smiled too tightly. A manager who paused beside him just long enough to make disapproval feel like policy. And then there was the waitress. Claire Bennett did not move like the others. She moved like someone balancing 3 different storms and refusing to let any of them spill. Her blonde hair was pinned up in a way that had started neat and surrendered to the rush of the dinner crowd, and the tiredness in her eyes did nothing to soften the steadiness in them. She brought the steak out herself, setting the plate in front of him with careful hands, the heat rising from it in fragrant waves, the seared edges glistening under the light. "I am sorry for the wait," she said softly, in the kind of voice that did not perform kindness. It simply lived there. Mason looked up then, just for a second, and saw something he had not seen all evening. Respect. Not the polished kind money buys. The real kind. The kind that says, "I see you." She adjusted the folded napkin beside his fork, and in that one smooth motion, so quick no one else noticed, she slid a small cream-colored note beneath the edge of the plate. Then she was gone again, turning toward another table, another order, another demand in a room full of people who never seemed to notice how hard someone had to work to keep their evening effortless. Mason stared at the note for a moment before touching it. Around him, the restaurant carried on. A burst of laughter from the bar, ice settling in a cocktail shaker, the sharp little ring of silverware against china. Somewhere behind him, he heard the manager mutter something under his breath and the low response of someone in the kitchen. The steak in front of him was perfect, still steaming, but Mason did not lift his knife. He slid the note free with 2 fingers and unfolded it once. His eyes moved across the first line, then the second, and then they stopped completely. The room did not actually go quiet, but to him it did. Everything seemed to pull away from the table, every clink and murmur fading beneath the weight of one handwritten sentence in blue ink. A hot meal should never come with shame. Mason went still, the paper caught between his fingers, his chest tightening with something deeper than surprise. Because in a restaurant built on appearances, a woman who had almost nothing had just protected the one thing he had come there to test. And without realizing it, she had touched the one wound money had never fully healed. Claire Bennett had learned how to keep smiling even when her whole body wanted to fold in half. By 8:30 that night, the skin at the back of her heels had already started to sting from shoes that were half a size too small. Her lower back throbbed each time she reached for a tray, and the folded pharmacy receipt tucked inside her apron pocket felt heavier than cash ever did. $184.60 for her mother's refill, due by noon the next day. $90 still missing from rent. 12 hours since she had eaten anything more solid than a granola bar and the last sip of coffee she had poured into. A paper cup before sunrise. None of that showed on her face when she stepped out under the warm dining room lights, because Hawthorne Grill did not reward honesty about exhaustion. It rewarded polish. It rewarded silence. It rewarded people who could be falling apart and still make a table of strangers feel like royalty. Claire had gotten good at that. Good enough that the manager kept handing her the difficult sections, the late walk-ins, the customers who snapped their fingers instead of making eye contact. He called it trust. She knew it was convenience. She was the one who did not argue. The one who stayed 10 minutes late that became 30, then 50, because somebody had to wipe down the last booth and reset the salt shakers and smile through the ache. From the service station near the kitchen doors, she had noticed the man at table 17 almost the second he sat down. Not because he made a scene. He did the opposite. He made himself smaller, as if years of being unwelcome had taught him how to disappear in public. But Claire also noticed the pause at the host's stand, the look from the bartender, the manager's quick once-over that had nothing to do with hospitality and everything to do with judgment. It was a look she recognized because she had lived under versions of it her whole life. The girl from Cicero with the second-hand winter coat. The student who dropped out when hospital bills stacked too high. The waitress people thanked without ever quite seeing. So when she saw the manager lean over the point-of-sale terminal and alter the check after the steak had already been rung in, her stomach tightened. An upcharge that had not been explained. An extra fee slipped in because he assumed the man would be too embarrassed to question it, too tired to fight, too afraid of becoming a spectacle in a room full of polished shoes and lowered voices. Claire stood there holding 2 iced teas and felt that familiar split second where life asks what kind of person you are when kindness might cost you. Then she made her choice. She rewrote the check, covered the difference with the cash she had been saving for gas, tore a corner from her server pad, wrote the words fast before she could think herself out of them. Not elegant words, not clever, just true ones. Then she slid the note beneath the plate and walked away before fear could catch up with her. Now, as she carried a loaded tray past table 17 again, she saw his hand still on the paper, his expression gone strange and distant, like something inside him had opened that he had not meant to show anyone. For one brief second, their eyes met. Claire looked away first, not because she was ashamed, but because she did not want thanks. That was the thing no one in that room seemed to understand. Dignity was not charity. It was not pity. It was the smallest decent choice made at the exact moment humiliation expected to win. The note stayed in Mason Reed's hand long after the steak had stopped sending up steam. He read the sentence again, then a third time, as if the ink might shift and become something easier to carry. A hot meal should never come with shame. Most people in the room would have seen it as a kind gesture from an overworked waitress to a stranger who looked down on his luck. But to Mason, it landed somewhere much deeper, in a place that had never really stopped aching. When he was 10 years old, before the tailored suits and the corner office and the glossy business magazines that liked to call him self-made, there had been a diner off Route 14 in northern Illinois where his mother worked the breakfast shift. She wore white sneakers with the soles coming loose and tied her apron too tight around a waist that had grown thinner that winter. Some nights, when the cupboards at home held little more than canned soup and saltines, she would bring him in after close, sit him at the counter, and slide over a plate of eggs or a grilled cheese the cook had quietly left behind. Once, when Mason asked if they were allowed to eat food they had not paid for, she had touched the back of his hand and said, "A hot meal should never come with shame." He had not thought about those exact words in years. Not since the funeral. Not since the first $1 million hit his account, and he promised himself no one would ever look at him and see lack again. Yet here they were, written in blue ink by a woman who could not possibly know she had reached back through 2 decades and pulled on a thread tied straight to his mother's voice. He set the note beside the plate with a care that surprised even him. Around him, Hawthorne Grill had returned to its performance of ease. A couple near the window debated Napa cabs with the seriousness of diplomats. Someone laughed too loudly at the bar. A server floated by carrying 2 ribeyes and a baked potato crowned with sour cream. But Mason was no longer watching the room with the cool, detached focus he had trained himself to keep during these undercover visits. He had started the night collecting evidence, timing service, observing staff behavior, measuring how quickly respect vanished when status seemed absent. He had built Reed Hospitality Group by telling investors that details revealed character, and he believed that. Still did. Yet what Claire Bennett had done was more than a detail. It was character exposed under pressure, kindness chosen in a room that rewarded the opposite. He glanced toward the service station and saw her reaching for a stack of dessert menus, tucking one loose strand of hair behind her ear with the back of her wrist because both hands were busy. She looked tired in the way people did when life had been asking for more than it gave back, but there was no self-pity in her, no visible appeal for rescue. Only motion, purpose, a quiet refusal to let the world make her hard. Mason took out the altered check and compared it to the itemized total on his phone from the order he had entered through the chain's internal audit system before walking in. She had been right. The numbers did not match. He should have felt vindicated. Instead, he felt something rarer and more dangerous. Hope. Not in the restaurant. Not in the brand. In her. He reached for his wallet, left enough cash to cover the meal, and more than enough for a generous tip, then folded the note and slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat rather than throwing it away with the receipt. By the time he stood to leave, he had already made a decision. He was coming back in the morning, not as a man no one noticed, but as the one person in that building who could finally make the right people answer for what she had risked to protect. Claire barely slept. By the time her alarm went off at 5:45, the sky outside her apartment window was still the color of wet concrete, and the radiator in the corner hissed like it had been fighting the same losing battle all winter. She lay there for one extra breath, staring at the hairline crack running across the ceiling, trying not to do the math she already knew by heart. Rent due. Electric bill overdue. Her mother's prescription waiting at the pharmacy. Then her phone lit up on the milk crate she used as a nightstand, and the message from Hawthorne Grill made her stomach drop before she even opened it. Be here at 8 sharp. Mandatory staff meeting. Ownership present. Claire sat up so fast the room tilted. Ownership never came in on a Friday morning without a reason, and reasons in restaurants usually rolled downhill toward the people who could least afford them. She dressed in silence, pulling on black slacks still damp at the hem from the sleet the night before, twisting her hair into a tighter knot than usual, and leaving the apartment with half a piece of toast in her hand. The train downtown was crowded with commuters holding paper cups and tired expressions, but Claire felt strangely apart from all of them, her mind replaying the moment she had slipped the note beneath the plate. At the time it had felt simple, necessary. By morning, it felt expensive. Hawthorne Grill looked different before opening, stripped of its evening glamour. The lights were brighter, less forgiving. Chairs still sat upside down on some tables. The bar smelled faintly of lemon polish and stale red wine. In the private dining room off the main floor, the staff had already gathered in a tense little cluster, everyone dressed in black, everyone pretending not to speculate. The manager, Derek, stood near the doorway with a clipboard tucked under one arm and the smug, over-controlled expression of a man who already knew where the blame was going. When Claire walked in, his eyes flicked to her and held half a second too long. That was all it took. Her pulse picked up. Nice of you to make it, he said, smooth and quiet, though she was 3 minutes early. Claire said nothing. She moved to the back of the room and folded her hands in front of her apron, keeping her face neutral the way years of customer service had taught her to do. At 8 on the dot, the side door opened. Every conversation died at once. The man who stepped in did not look anything like the one from table 17, and yet Claire knew him instantly. The shoulders were the same. The eyes were the same. But the damp coat and scuffed boots were gone. In their place was a navy suit cut so sharply it seemed to change the temperature of the room, a crisp white shirt, a dark tie, and the calm, measured presence of someone completely accustomed to being listened to. Mason Reed did not hurry. He walked to the head of the long table and set a leather folder down with deliberate care. Claire felt the blood drain from her face. Around her, someone whispered his name under their breath, and another person inhaled sharply as recognition spread across the room like electricity. Reed Hospitality Group, founder and chief executive officer. The man whose photograph appeared in trade magazines and airport newsstands. The man who owned Hawthorne Grill and 23 other properties across the Midwest. Mason let the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone feel it. Then he looked directly at Derek first, and then at Claire. "Thank you for coming in early," he said, his voice low and even, polished without being warm. "I spent last night in this restaurant as a guest none of you believed mattered." No one moved. Derek straightened, already preparing the posture of a man about to explain someone else's failure. But Mason opened the folder, lifted a single check, and placed it on the table. "The problem in this restaurant," he said, each word landing with terrifying calm, "is not the waitress who protected a guest. It is the people who watched humiliation happen and called it policy." Claire forgot to breathe. Derek's expression cracked for the first time. And in that bright, unforgiving morning light, with the room frozen around them, Claire realized the stranger she had tried to save had come back with the power to change everything. For a moment, no one in the private dining room seemed to remember how to stand naturally. Derek's hand tightened around his clipboard, the tendons in his jaw jumping as he forced out a thin smile that fooled no one. "Mr. Reed, I think there has been a misunderstanding," he said, too quickly, too smoothly, the words arriving with the practiced confidence of a man who had talked his way around consequences before. "If a server chose to interfere with standard billing procedure, I can assure you that was not management policy." Mason did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He opened the folder in front of him and slid 3 items across the table with calm precision. The original system price from the internal audit order he had entered before arriving, the altered guest check printed at the restaurant, and a time-stamped register record showing a manual change made 2 minutes before the bill was dropped. "You are right," Mason said, his expression unreadable. "It was not standard billing procedure. That is exactly the problem." He let the words settle into the room. "What I saw last night was not hospitality. It was assumption. It was arrogance. And it was the kind of quiet humiliation that ruins a brand long before it ruins a balance sheet." Claire stood frozen at the back of the room, her pulse thudding in her ears. She had spent the train ride convincing herself she would be fired before breakfast. Instead, she was watching the most powerful man in the building peel back the night she had tried to survive and expose every ugly layer she had hoped would stay buried. Derek shifted his weight. "With respect, sir, you came in looking." He stopped himself, but the unfinished sentence landed anyway. Mason's eyes turned cold. "Looking like what?" he asked, not loudly, but with a stillness that made everyone else stare at the floor. "Looking unworthy of decent service? Looking like someone your staff could embarrass because he did not appear rich enough to defend himself." Derek said nothing. Mason closed the folder. "You are suspended effective immediately pending full review," he said. "Human Resources will contact you before noon. You will turn in your access card before leaving the building." A server near the wall inhaled softly. Someone else lowered their eyes to hide a flicker of satisfaction. Derek looked as if he wanted to argue, but the room had already moved on without him. For the first time since Claire had worked there, authority had chosen truth over convenience. Mason's gaze shifted across the staff and rested on her. It did not feel accidental. "The rest of you should hear this clearly," he said. "A guest's dignity is not a luxury item. It is not reserved for people in cashmere coats or corner tables. If this company cannot remember that, then this company does not deserve to call itself hospitality." Claire felt heat rise behind her eyes and fought it back. She hated crying at work, hated anything that made struggle visible. But this was not pity, and somehow that made it harder to shield herself from. Mason reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and unfolded the cream-colored note with careful hands. She recognized the blue ink immediately. Her own handwriting looked startlingly small in his fingers. "The words on this paper," he said, glancing at Claire before looking back at the room, "were written by someone making server wages in a restaurant that did not protect her. And they carried more integrity than every management decision made here last night." Then, more quietly, with something personal entering his voice for the first time, he added, "They also happened to repeat something my mother used to say." Claire's breath caught. The room remained silent, but the silence had changed. It no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to wait. Meaning. Mason folded the note once more and slipped it back into his pocket, as if it were worth more than anything else he had brought into the room. "Everyone else may go," he said. "Ms. Bennett, I would appreciate it if you stayed." And as the staff slowly began filing out, glancing at her with open curiosity now instead of dismissal, Claire stood rooted in place, realizing that the worst night of her month had just turned into the most uncertain morning of her life. The private dining room felt strangely larger after everyone left, as if the tension had taken up physical space and only now begun to drain away. Claire stood near the back chair she had not used, fingers lightly pressed against the fabric of her apron, while Mason remained at the head of the table with one hand resting on the leather folder. In the quieter light of morning, without the disguise and without an audience, he seemed less like a stranger and more like a fact she had not yet learned how to hold. Claire looked at him carefully, still trying to reconcile the man who had sat alone in a damp coat with the one now, wearing a watch that probably cost more than her car, had before it died last winter. "If this is the part where you thank me and hand me an envelope," she said at last, her voice steady even though her heart was not. "You do not need to." I was not trying to impress anybody. For the first time that morning, something softer moved across Mason's face. Not amusement exactly. Respect. "I know," he said. "That is the only reason I am speaking to you now." He pulled out a chair across from him, not as a command, but as an invitation. After a beat, Claire sat. She kept her back straight and her expression guarded. Mason did not seem offended by the caution. If anything, he looked as though he expected it. "Last night was not an isolated problem," he said. "Over the past 6 months, we have had complaints across multiple locations. Not all of them dramatic. Most of them small enough to be ignored by people who only read summaries. Guests treated differently based on what they wear. Staff pushed to prioritize appearances over fairness. Managers confusing control with leadership." He paused, then added, "I started doing these visits because I needed to see the truth without anyone performing for me." Claire glanced toward the door Derek had gone through, then back at Mason. "And what did you decide?" she asked. Mason reached into his jacket and placed her folded note on the table between them. He did not open it this time. He did not need to. "I decided the truth is not in the policy manual," he said. "It is in the people who choose what to do when policy fails." Claire looked at the note and felt a quiet rush of embarrassment. Up close, the paper seemed ordinary. Slightly bent at one corner. Torn from a cheap server pad. Nothing about it looked important. Yet Mason handled it like something irreplaceable. "I do not want to reward you for being kind," he continued. "Kindness should not require a reward. I want to offer you something else. A seat at the table where these decisions get made." Claire blinked. For a second, she thought she had misheard him. Mason opened the folder and turned it toward her. Inside was a proposal, neatly typed, with the company logo at the top and a working title beneath it, Guest Dignity Initiative. "I am creating a pilot program," he said. "Training standards, anonymous meal support options, manager accountability, guest recovery procedures that protect dignity instead of bruising it. I do not need another consultant who has never carried 3 plates on aching feet. I need someone who knows exactly what this work feels like from the floor." Claire stared at the page, then at him. "You want a waitress to help redesign policy for a multi-state hospitality group?" she asked, disbelief edging every word. "I want the woman who saw a problem, solved it quietly, and took the risk herself," Mason said. "Titles can be updated. Character is harder to find." Claire let out a slow breath and looked back down at the proposal. Her name was already printed on the first page under temporary advisory lead. It should have felt flattering. It felt dangerous. Promises had always been expensive in her life. "And if I say no?" she asked. Mason leaned back slightly, giving the question room. "Then I will still make the changes," he said. "But I will know I tried to build them with the one person who understood why they mattered before anyone else in that room did." Claire lifted her eyes to his again, and in the silence that followed, she realized this was not rescue. It was something harder and maybe more frightening. It was a chance. Claire did not answer right away. She closed the folder with both hands, as if the paper inside might suddenly become lighter if she handled it carefully enough, then looked past Mason toward the dining room windows where the gray Chicago morning pressed against the glass. For one dangerous second, she let herself imagine what yes might look like. No more double shifts stacked on tired feet. No more choosing between rent and prescriptions. No more managers like Derek deciding who deserved respect and who could be ignored. But hope had sharp edges when you grew up without a safety net. And Claire had learned the hard way that the prettiest offers sometimes came with the ugliest price. "I cannot be your inspiration story," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "I cannot stand in a boardroom while people congratulate themselves for discovering that poor people are human." Mason held her gaze without flinching. "That is not what I am asking," he said. "Maybe not on paper," Claire replied, rising from her chair before she could lose her nerve. "But I know how this works. Somebody like me gets pulled into something bigger, everybody calls it opportunity, and the minute I stop sounding grateful, I become difficult." She pushed the folder gently back across the table. "You are asking me to trust a world that has not exactly earned that from me." Mason stood too, though more slowly, as if he understood that rushing her would make the room smaller. "That is fair," he said, "but for what it is worth, I am not asking for gratitude." Claire gave a quiet, humorless laugh. That may be the first thing a man with your kind of money has ever said that I actually believe. The words surprised both of them a little. So did the silence that followed. It was not awkward, just honest. Mason glanced at the note still resting beside the folder. You know what impressed me most about last night? He asked. Claire crossed her arms loosely. That I can write fast under pressure? A faint warmth touched his expression. That you protected someone when you thought it would cost you and gain you nothing. He paused. People reveal themselves most clearly when no reward is in sight. Claire wanted to dismiss that, but she could not. The problem was not that he sounded false. The problem was that he sounded sincere, and sincerity was harder to defend against. She thought of her mother at home with the heating turned low to save money, of the pharmacy text waiting on her phone, of the years she had spent being told to work harder, smile brighter, and expect less. She also thought of the dining room last night, of the easy cruelty built into small choices, and how tired she was of watching decent people get taught that dignity was optional. Even if I said yes, she said, I do not have a degree in corporate anything. I have a community college semester and 6 years of carrying trays. Then you have 6 years of field experience. Most executives would pay consultants to explain badly, Mason said. I can hire for credentials. I cannot hire for moral clarity. Claire looked away before he could see how deeply that landed. Through the glass, the city was fully awake now. Cabs moving through slush, people hurrying along the sidewalk with collars turned up against the wind. Life did not stop because one impossible offer had just landed in her lap. Bills still waited. Trains still ran late. Her next shift was still on the schedule unless somebody changed it. I need time, she said at last. Mason nodded once. No pressure, no persuasion, just space. He slid a business card from the folder and set it beside the note. Take the weekend, he said. Read everything. Call me if your answer is no, and call me if your answer is yes. Either way, it will be your decision. Claire picked up the card, then the note, her fingers lingering on the crease in the paper she had written without thinking, and he had somehow turned into something worth keeping. When she finally met his eyes again, she no longer saw just the millionaire who could change her life. She saw a man who had put a door in front of her and, for once, was not trying to push her through it. That should have made the choice easier. Instead, somehow, it made it harder. Claire called him on Monday at 9:12 in the morning, after dropping off her mother's prescription, after standing for 6 minutes outside a corner coffee shop with his business card in one hand and a paper cup she could barely afford in the other, after telling herself 3 separate times that saying yes did not mean surrender. When Mason answered on the second ring, his voice was calm and direct, as if he had been expecting the call but had refused to expect any particular answer. I will do it, Claire said before fear could rearrange the sentence. Then she added, but not as your charity project, and not because I owe you gratitude. There was a pause, brief and steady. Good, Mason said. Those were my favorite conditions. By Wednesday, she was sitting in a glass-walled conference room on the 31st floor of Reed Hospitality Group headquarters, looking out over the gray-blue spread of Lake Michigan and feeling more out of place than she had ever felt in Hawthorne Grill. Men in tailored jackets and women with perfect blowouts spoke in polished phrases about customer touchpoints, brand positioning, and service recovery metrics, while Claire sat with a legal pad in front of her and a borrowed blazer that still felt like somebody else's life on her shoulders. At first, no one quite knew what to do with her. Some smiled too brightly. Some glanced at her nameplate, then at Mason, as if trying to understand why a server from one Chicago location had been given a seat at that table. Claire noticed everything. The little pauses. The careful tone people used when they assumed competence must be explained slowly. It might have crushed an older version of her. This version had spent years surviving on tips and instinct. She knew how to read a room, and by the end of the first meeting, she knew exactly what was wrong with theirs. You keep using the word experience like it begins when the guest sits down, she said, cutting through a presentation slide filled with neat bullet points and expensive jargon. The room went still. Claire looked around the table and kept going. It starts at the door. It starts with whether the host smiles differently at a man in work boots than a man in loafers. It starts with whether a tired mother asking for water for her kids gets treated like a burden. It starts with whether staff are trained to protect dignity before profit. No one interrupted her. A vice president slowly lowered his pen. Mason, seated halfway down the table, said nothing at all, but something in his expression changed, not with surprise, but recognition, as if he had known she would do exactly this once given the chance. Over the next 6 weeks, Claire stopped looking borrowed and started looking inevitable. She rewrote guest recovery language so it sounded human instead of defensive. She built a discreet meal assistance protocol that allowed managers to resolve hardship situations without humiliation or spectacle. She insisted on staff training built from real scenarios, not executive guesses. And when one regional director questioned whether dignity policy was too soft to scale, Claire answered with numbers, turnover costs, guest retention, and the simple truth that respect was not softness, it was standards. Mason gave her room to work, and that, more than anything, began to matter. He did not hover. He did not rescue. He listened, sometimes late in the evening, long after most of the office had emptied and the city lights turned the windows into mirrors. They stayed in the conference room reviewing edits side by side, takeout containers between them, sleeves rolled up, both too tired for pretense. That was when she learned he drank bad coffee when he forgot to eat, and he learned she made notes in the margins when she was thinking hardest. Their conversations moved beyond policy in fragments, then in longer stretches. His mother, her father leaving when she was 16, the strange loneliness of being underestimated, the even stranger loneliness of being known only for power. Nothing between them was rushed. It grew the way trust grows when two people keep choosing honesty in small, unremarkable moments. And one rainy night, as Claire packed up her papers and Mason reached across the table to hand her the folded cream-colored note he had carried since Hawthorne Grill, their fingers brushed for the briefest second, and both of them went still, not because the touch was dramatic, but because by then it no longer felt accidental. 6 months later, the flagship opening on Michigan Avenue did not look anything like the Hawthorne Grill Claire Bennett had walked into on aching feet and too little sleep. This place still had the amber light, the polished glass, the quiet confidence of money, but something in the air felt different, lighter somehow, as if elegance no longer required anyone else to feel small. Near the entrance, beside the host's stand, a bronze plaque caught the attention of every guest who paused long enough to read it. Dignity is part of service. No one leaves ashamed. Underneath those words, framed in white linen and glass, sat a small cream-colored note written in blue ink, the corners still slightly bent, the handwriting unmistakably Claire's. She had argued against displaying it. Mason had listened, then told her gently that the note did not belong to him anymore and did not belong to the company either. It belonged to the standard that had changed both. Now, standing in a midnight blue dress that still felt a little unreal on her, Claire watched guests stop in front of that frame and go quiet for the exact same reason Mason had gone quiet that night. Some objects became important because they were expensive, others because they told the truth. Across the room, servers moved with calm efficiency through a crowd that included city officials, investors, managers from every Reed property in the Midwest, and a handful of people Claire cared about far more than any of them. Her mother sat near the front with careful posture and bright eyes, wearing the pearl earrings Claire had bought her with the first bonus check she had ever accepted without guilt. For the first time in years, her mother looked rested. It hit Claire then, more sharply than any speech could have, how much life had changed in half a year. Not by magic, not by rescue, by work, by choices, by being taken seriously and then proving, over and over again, that she deserved to be. When Mason stepped onto the small stage near the bar, the room softened into silence. He wore a black suit tonight, simple and precise, but his eyes found Claire almost immediately, and the look he gave her held none of the distance it once had. "Before we celebrate this opening," he said, microphone low in his hand, "I need to tell you the truth about why this room exists the way it does." He spoke about standards, about leadership, about the hidden damage caused when hospitality becomes performance instead of care. Then he told them about a rainy Thursday in Chicago, about a waitress who had no reason to believe she was being watched by anyone who could change her future, and who chose decency anyway. He did not make her a symbol. He made her specific, brave, real. This initiative was not born in a boardroom, he said. It began the night one woman refused to let dignity become optional. Then he turned toward her and held out his hand. "Claire Bennett, please join me." The applause started before she moved, rising warm and full around her as she crossed the room on legs that suddenly felt less steady than they had in front of any executive table. When she reached the stage, Mason did not rush the moment. He let the room see what respect looked like. As of tonight, he said, Claire Bennett is officially Director of Guest Dignity and Service Culture for Reed Hospitality Group. The applause came harder this time. Claire laughed through the sting in her eyes and shook her head once, overwhelmed in the quiet, private way she always had been. But Mason was not finished. He reached into his inside pocket and drew out the note, not the framed copy by the door, but the original one he had kept with him through every meeting, every revision, every long night at the office. "There is one more thing," he said, his voice softening in a way that made the room lean closer. He looked at her, not the audience now, not the investors, not the cameras from the local business press. Just her. "The night you wrote this, you thought you were protecting a stranger from embarrassment. What you actually did was remind me who I wanted to be before success taught me to confuse control with strength." His thumb brushed lightly over the folded paper. "You gave this company a conscience. You gave me back a piece of my mother. And somewhere between conference rooms, bad coffee, and all the ways you refused to let me take the easy road, you became the person I trust most in this world." The room had gone perfectly still. Claire could hear her own heartbeat, could see the tenderness he was no longer trying to hide. "I am not asking for an answer in front of a crowd," Mason said, and a ripple of gentle laughter moved through the guests. "But I am saying this where everyone can hear it. I love you, Claire. Not for the note. Not for what you changed in my company. For who you are when nobody is watching." Claire looked at him for one long second that seemed to gather every tired shift, every hard year, every impossible turn that had brought her here. Then she took the note from his hand, held it to her chest, and said the only honest thing left. "Good," she whispered, smiling through tears she no longer cared to hide. "Because I love you too." And in a room built on a new promise, under warm light that no longer belonged only to the wealthy, justice and love finally looked like the same thing.